The wind came prowling across the prairie, like it had a mind of its own, cold and restless, rattling the boards of the old ranch house, and carrying with it the smell of snow and sage. Elias Boone stood alone at the small pine table, one hand steadying a candle, the other shaking just enough to betray the weight in his chest. Christmas Eve had a way of doing that to a man, especially when the woman who once shared the table with him had been gone 3 long winters. The flame caught the wick at last, and light bloomed soft and yellow, chasing shadows off the walls. He whispered her name, Anna, like a prayer he was not sure anyone still heard outside. The Boone spread lay quiet under a pale sky, fence posts half buried in snow, cattle huddled down in the low ground, the barn standing dark and patient as an old horse. Elias had worked this land since he was barely more than a boy, breaking sod, mending wire, fighting drought and blizzard alike, but none of that had carved him the way grief had. Anna had been buried on a hill overlooking the creek, and every Christmas Eve since, he lit a candle for her, sat with it a while, and remembered the sound of her laugh in this very room, the way she used to hum while stirring stew, the way she believed even the hardest winters ended this year was meant to be no different, or so he had told himself, yet the unopened letter on the table said otherwise, its edges worn from being handled too many times, the writing neat and unfamiliar, stamped and travelled from back east, from a place with streets and gas lamps and people who did not know the loneliness of miles. He had answered an advertisement months ago in a moment of weakness, or courage, he was not sure which, a mail-ordered bride service promising companionship, faith, and a willingness to start anew on the frontier. He had not truly believed it would come to this night. Elias sat, the chair creaking beneath his weight, and watched the candle burn. Memories rose like smoke. Anna, standing in the doorway their first Christmas together, snow in her hair, eyes bright with hope. They had been poor then, but rich in all the ways that mattered. He had sworn after her passing that no woman would cross that threshold again, not like that, not into her place. Yet loneliness had a voice of its own, and on the plains, it spoke loudest after sundown. The knock came sudden and sharp, cutting clean through his thoughts. 3 raps, firm and certain. Elias froze, heart thudding harder than any stampede he had faced. No one came out this way after dark in winter, not unless they had to. His eyes went to the door, then to the candle. The flame flickered, as if it too sensed the moment. He stood slow, every step heavy, the floorboards groaning in protest. Another knock followed, closer now, more urgent, as if the night itself demanded he answer. His hand found the door latch, rough iron cold against his palm. 100 questions crowded his mind. Was it trouble? Was it a traveler lost in the storm? Or was it the answer to a letter he had nearly burned? He thought of Anna again, of the promises they once made under a sky just like this. The wind pressed against the door, whispering, urging. Elias drew a breath deep enough to steady himself, and pulled the door open. Cold air rushed in, along with the smell of snow and horse. Standing there on the porch was a woman wrapped in a heavy wool coat, bonnet pulled low, cheeks red from the wind. She held a small valise in one hand, the other tucked tight against her side. Her eyes lifted to meet his, clear and uncertain, yet brave. Behind her, a hired driver tipped his hat, already turning back toward the road. As if leaving them to fate for a long moment, neither spoke. The candlelight spilled out across the porch, casting a warm glow around them both. Elias felt the past and future collide in his chest. Grief standing shoulder to shoulder with something that looked a lot like hope. He stepped aside at last, the gesture small but full of meaning, and in that quiet space between them, Christmas Eve held its breath, waiting to see what kind of man would rise from the ashes of memory and open his home, and his heart. Once more the woman stepped inside with a cautious grace, snow melting from the hem of her coat onto the worn wooden floor. Elias closed the door behind her, and the wind's howl was cut off as if by a knife, leaving only the crackle of the candle and the slow thud of his own heartbeat. She lowered her bonnet and revealed hair the color of autumn wheat, eyes a deep thoughtful brown that took in the room without judgment, as if she were measuring not the furniture or the poverty of the place, but the spirit that lived there. She introduced herself in a soft voice as Margaret Whitmore, her words careful yet steady, explaining the long journey, the train west, the wagon north, the final miles taken in the dark because Christmas Eve waits for no one. Elias nodded more than he spoke, feeling clumsy and out of practice with company, especially a woman who had come here with expectations he barely knew how to meet. He offered her a chair by the table and poured coffee that had been sitting on the stove too long. Apologizing for its bitterness, she smiled faintly and said she had tasted worse on the road. The candle stood between them like a small, fragile witness. Margaret's eyes drifted to it, and then to the single-framed photograph on the wall, Anna's face captured in a younger, happier time. Elias followed her gaze and felt the old ache rise again. He told her about his wife, without being asked, about the sickness that took her one spring too soon, about the silence that followed, his voice rough but honest. Margaret listened with her hands folded in her lap, offering no interruption, no pity, only presence. And when he finished, she spoke of her own losses, parents gone, siblings scattered, a life back east that held little promise for a woman who wanted more than survival. As the night deepened, the house seemed to breathe around them, old timbers settling, shadows shifting with the candle's slow burn. Elias felt torn between two loyalties, the memory of Anna that lived in every corner of the room, and the living woman sitting across from him, flesh and blood and possibility. Margaret asked about the land, about the cattle, about the winters that tested a person's resolve, and he answered plainly, making no attempt to soften the truth. He told her this was hard country, that loneliness could drive a person half mad, that love here was not a thing of poems but of shared labor and quiet endurance. She nodded, as if she understood more than he expected, saying she did not come chasing romance but partnership, a place to belong, a chance to build something lasting even if it grew from grief later. He showed her the small spare room that had once been meant for children who never came, the bed neatly made, the quilt folded with care. Margaret thanked him and paused at the doorway, telling him she knew tonight carried weight, that she did not wish to replace what had been lost, but hoped to stand beside it. Elias stood in the hall long after she closed the door, staring at the floorboards where Anna used to pace while waiting for bread to rise. Doubt gnawed at him, fear that he was betraying a promise made at a graveside. Yet another voice whispered that perhaps Anna would not want him frozen in time. Perhaps love was not diminished by being shared again. Sleep came fitful, Elias drifting in and out as memories tangled with new images. Margaret's steady gaze, Anna's laughter, the candle flame dancing between them all. Before dawn he rose and went outside, the stars sharp overhead, snow crunching beneath his boots. He stood at the edge of the yard and looked toward the hill where Anna lay, speaking aloud to her for the first time in months, telling her of the woman inside, of his confusion, of the strange hope that scared him more than solitude ever had. The wind answered with a low sigh through the grass, neither blessing nor curse, just the vast indifference of the plains when morning finally broke. Pale and cold, Elias returned inside to find Margaret already awake. A simple breakfast laid out as best she could manage. She apologized for taking liberties. He surprised himself by laughing softly and telling her it was the first Christmas morning the house had smelled like coffee and bread since Anna passed. They ate in a companionable silence that felt earned rather than awkward. Outside the sun climbed over the horizon, painting the snow in gold, and for the first time in years, the day did not feel like something to be endured after breakfast. Margaret asked if she might see the land, and Elias bundled them both against the cold, walking her to the barn, the corrals, the creek frozen solid. He spoke of his plans, cautious but real, repairs needed, cattle to sell come spring. She spoke of skills learned back east, keeping accounts, tending gardens, teaching children, each word knitting a small thread between them. Neither promised love, neither demanded it, but something quieter and sturdier began to take shape, an understanding born not of passion but of shared resolve. As they returned to the house, Elias glanced back once more at the distant hill. The ache was still there, but it no longer felt like an anchor dragging him under, more like a scar that proved he had survived. Christmas Day stretched before them, uncertain and uncharted, and as he opened the door for Margaret, Elias realized that lighting a candle for the past did not mean he had to live in its shadow forever. Sometimes, the flame was meant to guide the living forward. Christmas afternoon settled slow and quiet over the Boone spread, the kind of stillness that made every sound feel important. The creak of leather, the hiss of the stove, the soft murmur of voices learning one another. Elias found himself watching Margaret as she moved about the kitchen, careful not to disturb the way things were, yet not afraid to make them warmer. She folded the quilt Anna had sewn and laid it across the back of a chair, not as a replacement but as a sign of respect, and that simple act struck him deeper than any grand speech could have. He realized then that this woman understood grief, not as something to conquer but something to walk beside, and the knowledge eased a tightness in his chest he had carried for years. They spoke later of expectations, not in the language of romance but in the plain, honest terms of frontier life. Elias told her he could not promise easy days, that there would be storms and sickness, and moments when the past rose up sharp and uninvited. Margaret answered that she did not fear hard work or quiet sorrow, that she feared only a life lived without purpose. She said she had chosen this path, knowing it might never lead to love as the world imagined it, but hoping it might lead to something steadier, a shared table, shared burdens, shared dawns. Her words settled between them like fresh snow, clean and unmarked. As evening drew near, Elias suggested they walk to the hill, and though the cold cut deep, Margaret agreed without hesitation. They climbed together through the snow, breath steaming, the land stretching wide and solemn around them. At the grave, Elias brushed snow from the marker and introduced Margaret aloud, his voice steady though his hands trembled. He spoke of Anna's kindness, her strength, her belief that love did not end but changed shape. Margaret stood quietly, head bowed, and when Elias finished, she placed a small sprig of evergreen at the stone, saying nothing, yet offering everything in that silence. On the walk back, Elias felt something shift, not a forgetting, never that, but an acceptance, as if the past had loosened its grip enough to allow room for the present. The stars came out one by one, bright and cold, and the house ahead glowed with lamplight, a beacon against the dark. He realized then that home was not just walls and memories, but choices made day by day, even when they frightened youth. That night, they sat again by candlelight. The same candle now burned low, its wax pooled thick at the base. Elias asked Margaret if she wished to stay, not just through winter, but beyond it, not as a guest, but as a partner. He made no promises of romance, only of honesty and effort. Margaret met his gaze and said yes in a voice that did not waver. The word carried the weight of a vow, simple yet profound. They agreed to marry come spring, quietly, without spectacle, giving time for roots to take hold, for trust to grow. The decision felt right in a way that surprised Elias, not sudden or reckless, but earned, like land finally ready to bear seed. After years of rest, the candle guttered and went out, yet the darkness no longer felt empty. In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Margaret learned the land, Elias learned patience. Together they honored what had been and nurtured what might be. The Boone spread did not change overnight, but something unseen had shifted. Laughter returned in small, measured doses. Hope took shape in plans whispered over coffee, and grief found its place among other truths, rather than ruling them. All years later, Elias would remember that Christmas Eve as the night he learned love could be both a memory and a promise, that lighting a candle for the dead did not dim the light meant for the living. And on every Christmas that followed, he lit 2 candles, one for Anna, one for the life that had risen from her ashes. Steady flames standing side by side, just like the hearts they represented.